One of history's most infamous and brutal kings has to be King Henry VIII. He is most famous for the fact he had 6 wives, with 2 of these being executed inside the walls of the Tower of London at the king's orders. He was a large and grotesque man, however the Kingdom of England greatly loved their king. But Henry today is considered a brute due to the fact that around 70,000 people were executed during his almost 4-decade-long reign. However, today we look at the 10 most famous people executed by the Tudor monarch. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Anne Askew was a writer, poet and preacher who was condemned to die as a heretic during the latter part of Henry's reign. She is remembered as the only recorded woman ever tortured at the Tower of London, and her ordeal was horrific. She was so severely racked that many of her joints dislocated and her muscle fibres ripped. She had been accused of heresy after her strong Protestant preaching offended many. She began to become caught up in a conflict between Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's 6th wife, and religious leaders, and after being found guilty she was sentenced to death. She was to be burned at the stake and was taken to Smithfield on the 16th of July 1546. She was in so severe pain that she could not walk and had to be carried on a chair. The executioner placed a small bag of gunpowder around her neck to quicken her ordeal, and it would have been a horrific sight seeing the young lady burning alive. One of 3 Boleyns to make their way onto the list, Jane Boleyn was the sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn and subsequently Henry VIII. She had been a member of Catherine of Aragon's staff during Henry's first marriage, however she was a lady who had a rather dark side. When Henry VIII was looking for a way out of his marriage to Anne Boleyn, it was alleged that Jane testified against her husband George, as she was very jealous of the close relationship the brother and sister had. This helped to secure a guilty verdict for Anne on the count of treason, and this also condemned George. Jane's downfall came with Henry's 5th wife Catherine Howard, and Jane facilitated the young teenage queen to have liaisons and meetings with the king's favourite courtier, Thomas Culpeper, and to subsequently cheat on Henry VIII. For this, Jane paid the ultimate price and was beheaded by the commoner's axe inside the walls of the Tower of London. Our second Boleyn, George, was married to Jane, and he was a brother to Anne Boleyn. He would be the maternal uncle to the later Queen Elizabeth I, however he did not manage to see his niece's reign. When Henry looked for a way out of his marriage to Anne, Cromwell devised a plot to get rid of her, and this sinister web of lies placed George as a man who had slept with his sister. Alleged evidence was found about this, but it's most probable this was false, and because of this George was sentenced to death. His execution took place on Tower Hill, along with 4 other men who were accused of allegedly sleeping and committing treason with Henry's wife. He died by the commoner's axe. One of the biggest threats to Henry VIII's reign was the Pilgrimage of Grace, in which the north and in particular counties such as Yorkshire rose up. The rebels opposed Henry's religious reforms, and in particular the dissolution of the monasteries. This policy closed down religious houses across the country, and the riches of the monastic houses were transferred straight into the royal coffers. This rebellion became very serious, and 30,000 rebels stormed York and they took control of the city. The leader of this rebellion was Robert Aske, and Henry, it appears, did respect the lawyer. However, ultimately as the rebellion was put down and fell apart, Henry wanted Aske to pay for his treason. He was executed in horrific manner, being hanged from the walls of York Castle in chains in front of a huge crowd. When Henry VIII ordered the execution of Margaret Pole, he in a sense eliminated one of the most prominent threats to his kingship. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was one of the last remaining members of the Plantagenet dynasty. However, her son Reginald was a rather dissenting cardinal. This caused a great deal of strain for her, as England was transitioning to become Protestant, and Reginald was involved in Catholic plots to kill the king. She was sent to the Tower of London after Cromwell allegedly found evidence of a Catholic tunic in her house, and this was enough to link Margaret to a possible papal threat to kill the king. At the age of 67, on the 27th of May 1541, she was led out of the Tower of London to Tower Green, where a botched execution made a mess of her death. It was said the first blow grazed her neck, and then, according to Victorian myth, she was chased around the Tower of London's grounds as she sprang up from the block, and the axeman chased her around before taking her head off with several swings on the cobbled floor. A truly evil end for a once proud lady. Bishop John Fisher was a well-respected and highly thought-of member of the Catholic Church. However, his greatest flaw was his devotion to the Pope and the papacy. When Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church and he assumed the role of the supreme head of the Church of England, all members of the clergy were required to swear their support to the English king. However, Fisher refused to do this and was thrown into the Tower of London. Whilst here, he was kept in horrific conditions, being refused a priest, and he was given very little luxury. This was an attempt to get him to submit. However, he continued to refuse, and he declared that Henry was not the supreme head of the church. This only meant one thing. Henry greatly grew tired of Fisher and sentenced him to death. He was treated like a commoner and was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, but Henry later commuted this to beheading because of the outcry. On Tower Hill on the 22nd of June 1535, he was beheaded by the axe, and his death made people consider he was a martyr, and he became Britain's first martyr. He met his death with great calm and piety, but Henry ordered his body to be treated terribly, being left on the scaffold naked and then thrown into a rough grave. Thomas More was once incredibly close to Henry VIII. He was a highly thought-of scholar and served as the Lord High Chancellor. He was a skilled author, writing key histories on Richard III and also Utopia, which has been described as a fantastic book ahead of its time. He was possibly the second most important person in the land after the king. However, he fell from grace greatly. He opposed the Protestant Reformation and went to great lengths to deal with this, ordering punishments such as whippings and even executions. However, when Henry eventually introduced the Protestant Reformation to England, he could not support what Henry was doing to the Catholic Church, and he could not fully support his annulment to Catherine of Aragon. More continually refused to take the oath of supremacy, and because of this he was sentenced to death for treason. It was an incredibly sad downfall for such a great man. However, he was originally sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, but Henry commuted this to beheading. On Tower Hill on the 6th of July 1535, More made his way onto the scaffold, and he faced death bravely before the executioner took his head clean off with his axe. Thomas Cromwell's execution came at a great shock to every person in England. He was a king's right-hand man and was involved greatly in the king's marriages and also the dissolution of the monasteries. Cromwell made the king incredibly rich through this, and he was incredibly well sought after and was a master of spin. He knew how to manipulate court and was the one behind the downfall of Anne Boleyn. However, after arranging the king's failed marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell himself fell. Henry found his fourth wife unattractive, and for this it was a disaster for Cromwell. Following this, he was sentenced to death for treason by an act of attainder, and after the failed marriage, his political enemies really did dig their claws in. On the 28th of July 1540, he was taken to Tower Hill on the same day the king married Catherine Howard, and his head was then hacked from his shoulders. It was then put on a spike on London Bridge, but Henry later on went on to regret the execution of his former best friend. One of the most infamous executions in history, Catherine Howard today is seen as a tragic figure who suffered at the hands of men who took advantage of her. She was just around the age of 17 when she married the then grotesque and huge Henry VIII, who himself was 49. Her early life was called into question, as it was believed she had physical relations before marrying the king. However, the final nail in the coffin for Catherine was her affair with Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was an attractive courtier and close friend to the king, and he and Catherine hit it off, and they met in secret, facilitated by Jane Boleyn. In these secret meetings, it's alleged they had intimate relations. However, the truth eventually came out. Henry VIII was told of this indiscretion while he prayed at Hampton Court Palace, and for Catherine she was sentenced to death for treason. She was kept inside the Tower of London and spared no remorse. She was executed by the commoner's axe, and Henry then had her body thrown in a shallow grave, which allegedly then had quicklime poured onto it, as if she never existed on earth. The most famous execution to ever occur in England was that of Anne Boleyn's. Henry VIII's second wife fell from grace spectacularly at the hands of the manipulations of Thomas Cromwell. Henry, in order to secure Anne's hand in marriage, even split from the Catholic Church, plunging England into a great period of religious turmoil and upheaval. The English Reformation was caused by Anne Boleyn, but Henry grew tired of her after she failed to give him a son which he greatly desired. Because of this, Henry ordered Cromwell to find him a way out of the marriage, and Cromwell span an intricate web of lies that pinned the charges of treason, adultery, and even incest onto Anne. 5 men, including her brother, were also indicted on charges including sleeping with the Queen, and following a sham trial, she was sentenced to death. Henry did allow her some slight relief though, and he ordered her execution to take place inside the walls of the Tower of London. He also stated that she should be executed using a sword, with a swordsman being fetched from France to take her head. On the 19th of May 1536, she was taken out to Tower Green, and in front of a small crowd, the swordsman took her head clean off. Anne Boleyn's story is one that is still incredibly interesting and poignant. I hope you enjoyed this video looking at one of history's most famous kings and his evil deeds. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, like and also share. Once again, thanks for watching.